Why are SAS hard drives still a thing in 2026? Welcome back to the Raid Room. We've not been in here for a while, but for those that aren't aware, the Raid Room is where we take a subject that's deep niche, deep lore storage, and we pull it apart at the seams. Now, SAS hard drives are still a thing. The majority of hard drive manufacturers, standard, WD, Seagate, are still rocking them out to this day. And with every new, bigger, better capacity, when you're looking at your 30 TBs, your 24 TBs, they launch in SATA and SAS. But SAS, for the longest time, the reason people went for it opened the floodgate, for the most part, to higher performance. SATA giving you 6 gigabits per second, and SAS giving you 12 gigabits per second, depending on the SAS architecture and the backboard you've got. Now, back in the day, that was great, and it allowed people to really push the boundaries of what hard drives could do without that SATA constraint. To put it into perspective, one of the most popular drives back in my e-retail days was when people would buy these mini SAS mechanical hard drives called the Cheetah and the Raptor. These were drives that promoted 10,000 RPM and 15,000 RPM. That's the speed of the platters inside. Their general capacities always sat quite low numbers at like 150, 300 and 600 gig. And although there were some higher capacities, that was when you started to see the trade-off towards SSDs. And then SSDs came along, and although these are SATA, they are much better at fully occupying the SATA connection there, with performance generally sitting around 450, 500 megabytes per second reported performance. But that wasn't enough. M.2 NVMe came along, and the whole time, remember, SAS hard drives are there in the background going, we're still here, we still exist. But M.2 NVMe's arrived, and these were starting to talk about gigabytes per second performance. And at the same time as that, SATA hard drives started to find their place in the food chain. When you had M.2 NVMe's promoting performance but lower capacity and higher price, and you had your bigger hard drives that were cheaper per terabyte, but you could store a lot more. So why did SAS still exist? Well, we'll get to that, because alongside this, we started to see the preponderance of people merging these technologies. We saw things like SAS SSDs start to arrive on the scene. These were SSDs that were taking advantage of that larger bandwidth connection of the SAS connecting board, that 12 gigabit we just talked about, and we can get into dual connection as well later. But on top of that, you also saw U.2 and U.3 SSDs, which once again merged these technologies to allow them to start taking advantage of that gigabyte per second. And yet, despite all of that, SAS hard drives still exist. So, the three reasons for this, and there are, by the way, some ancillary ones, but the main three reasons are as follows. Number one, the dual connection. You know that if you look at a SAS connector, maybe I'll break the rules of the Raid Room and put a graphic on screen, but a normal SATA connection has separate data and power going into this board. That's singular data connection. SAS connections have got this combined one single port that has both of them, and it is more than just convenience. Part of the architecture comes down to SCSI when it comes to SAS, and we'll come to that later on, but ultimately, due to the rise of the necessity of failover and immediate reconnection in the event of your hardware failing, and also the rise in both affordability and popularity at even mid-scale business at high availability and dual controller architecture servers, having dual controllers and dual CPUs and dual RAM and dual connections and dual PSUs and all of that isn't going to be that good if the drives you're using are in debt or connected to only one of those brains. And that's where SAS comes in, because SAS hard drives have got a dual data connection architecture. They allow the drive to effectively exist as one drive, one set of platters, one set of actuator, and we'll get to that later. The whole kit and caboodle in one drive, but it is managed by two brains. Now that can be an external apparatus when you've got like a JBOD box connected to two major servers, or an active-active or active-passive server that's funneling in with dual controllers into the drive. And although it is workable on a software level in some cases, and some servers have rolled out that allow this to be used with SATA drives, it is a great deal easier and more efficient to use SAS hard drives. And yes, SAS SSDs exist, but then we're going back into that argument of price per terabyte. The next reason that SAS hard drives continue to exist, and this is probably the weakest reason of the three, by the way, is due to multi-actuator technology. Now, in this realm, I would argue Seagate are sort of the front runners for this currently. The actuator is the tiny little arms inside that flick around that read from the platters that are inside, the arms, if you will, inside. Again, crass oversimplification. Someone's going to eviscerate me in the comments. But a lot of early development went into, if you have, say, 10 platters inside a hard drive, and this, by the way, started right the way back when there were only 6 platters, what if you had 2 arms doing the reading? And you could actually time it and make sure that the arms themselves could get the job done. They're still next to each other, but they're working on top of each other, and the drive would ultimately effectively double the data throughput in terms of read and write. The drive would still need allocation for that data and a superior indexing system, so again, cache being crucial, but SAS drives do a great job of allowing for that dual actuator technology. Again, this is something afforded to SATA drives, but it is done better due to the SCSI architecture that, or the SCSI command set that SAS drives utilize there, because these drives that have got multiple actuators are actually technically 2 drives inside one box. So a 16 terabyte dual actuator drive is technically on a identifiable storage number level, or a LUN inside, is actually 2 8 terabyte LUNs. That's how it's able to negotiate the 2 actuators doing their job. But although dual actuator technology has never really broken into the consumer space or even light commercial space, it has not stopped brands like Seagate exploring dual actuator and going higher, with WD looking at quad actuator drives there. Again, the capacity won't increase vastly, and they will have to separate the capacity into those blocks, but it will allow for multiple actuators to get the job done. But it's just a question of drive sealing and the intelligent management of the data being passed through the drive controller, which once again is a reason why SAS hard drives are still here. Now, the third reason is a lot more basic, and that comes down to error correction and, looking at my notes the first time, the command I talked about earlier on. SCSI command are going onto these drives, and error management, it's a lot faster and a lot more proactive on SAS drives than it is on SATA. And if you are running mission critical, you need your drives to recognize error as fast as possible, because the faster you identify error, the faster you can offload. You can take that drive out and replace it with another. Not wait till it's broken, but you're starting to see it wobble. Yes, this is something that most users only get as a safety net, whereas the other 2 reasons SAS hard drives still exist are a little bit more proactive, arguably. But in industry standards, much like the storage industry, still heavily prioritizing ZFS or ZFS over the likes of BTRFS and certainly legacy file systems like ext4, it has to be said that SAS hard drives within veteran storage communities still have got that reliant sticker behind them. So though that third point is nowhere near as, compelling, arguably, to the man on the street as those first 2 reasons, it is probably one of the bigger reasons that storage veterans still heavily rely on SAS hard drives. But the winds are changing. Now we're starting to see, hard drive vendors start to, frankly, phase out smaller capacities in their production runs in certain product categories, certainly NAS, and we're seeing vast increases in storage drives. It's now going to be the time that we start to see hard drive manufacturers start refining their SAS portfolios equally. And again, maybe one day we'll see the likes of hybrid drives coming back into the fold, but I think their day has come and gone. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. Welcome back to the Raid Room. As ever, will be more of these coming up, and I'll see you next time.